Good afternoon. My name is Janet Frick, and I am with Salt Lake County Aging and Adult Services, the host agency for this year's Utah Elder Justice Conference. I want to welcome you to the session, Multidisciplinary Approach to Address Elder Justice session. I want to let you know that this session will be recorded for later viewing. As an attendee of this session, you will be able to see the presenter and only yourself by clicking on the bottom right of the screen at participants. And please also ask any questions throughout during the presentation, the Q&A portion, and that is also located at the bottom right, the button over there. I will now turn over the time to our presenters who will introduce themselves.
Thanks, Jenna. Well, good afternoon. Hope everybody had a great lunch and you're ready to hear a presentation about our multidisciplinary approach to how we address elder justice within the Division of Aging and Adult Services. I'm Tracy Lee. I am one of the program administrators at Adult Protective Services, and I'm excited to be here this afternoon. And we also have Rebecca Beaumont, who is one of our fantastic team members and who operates a grant for the Office of Victims of Crime that is specifically aimed at addressing and creating multidisciplinary teams throughout the state. And she will talk about her work later on in the presentations and some of the great collaborations that are going on throughout the state. So Rebecca, if you want to go ahead and start the presentation.
Yeah, I just need access to the share content button.
I was waiting for it to come up. I was going to say Bueller, I need my presentation. All right. Okay, go ahead, next slide. So we're going to do today just a really quick overview of what Adult Protective Services is and an overview of what abuse, neglect, and exploitation is for those that may not be in the field and do not understand what Adult Protective Services does. And then Rebecca will finish off the majority of the presentation on the multidisciplinary approach. So in the United States, at least 10% of adults age 65 and older experience some sort of elder abuse. And there's all sorts of statistics out there. This one is from the Elder Justice Initiative. And along with experiencing one type of abuse, many older adults also suffer other types of abuse at the same time. For example, people who suffer financial it's really common for them to also suffer emotional abuse along with it. Next slide. Utah is a mandatory reporting state. So any person who has reason to believe that any vulnerable adult has been subject of abuse, neglect, or exploitation should report to Adult Protective Services intake or the nearest law enforcement agency. In Utah, next slide, a vulnerable adult is considered anybody 65 and older, automatic. But we also investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in vulnerable adults who are between the ages of 18 and 64 who have a mental or physical impairment that substantially affects their ability to complete one of the main areas of living, and those are listed here, to be able to provide personal protection, basic necessities, obtain services, carry out their activities of daily living, manage their finance, or really understand the consequences of remaining in a situation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Next slide. So what Adult Protective Services does is we are an investigative agency that has a fantastic team throughout the state of 24 investigators and 5 intake staff. And we look into allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. During those investigations, we perform protective needs assessments to identify if the victim has a protective need. We coordinate or make referrals to our community resources, and we rely heavily and appreciate so much all of our community partners in the aging and disability networks that coordinate and really help us ensure that victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, or maltreatment, as I can refer to it easier, that they have the resources that they need to live a quality life. In the case of where we have identified a true protective need, we do provide short-term limited services to the vulnerable adult to ensure that the vulnerable adult is no longer at risk. Some of the things that APS cannot do are we cannot enter an adult's home without consent. We cannot take custody of an adult. We do not conduct welfare checks. We do not provide services without the voluntary consent of the victim unless we have a court order to do so. And we do not investigate when we get a report if the victim is deceased. We have to return those reports over to the appropriate agencies. So how to report to APS? We have several ways to report. And we have a line specifically set up for law enforcement, which is an email address at apsintake@utah.gov. You can fax a report. For those of you who still have the fax machines and are using that method, we have our intake hotline, which is open Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And we have a fantastic and well-trained intake team that is ready to help take your information down and to make the determination of whether a case will be opened or not. And then we also have the ability to report online 24/7. So if it's not during regular business hours, you can go online to our website at daas.utah.gov, and you can make an online report, which will be responded to the next. They will try to get to those to the next business day, and the ones that are emergent, they will get to the next business day. So APS's intake criteria, as I mentioned, we have a fabulous intake team, and they have a tough job. They sit all day and they listen to calls and read reports of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So they deserve kudos for all the work that they do. And it's also their job to help determine if an allegation of abuse, neglect, and exploitation exists. So some examples of when we do not open a case, just for your knowledge, is when there's not a current allegation. We get many reports where it does not rise to the level of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. There's just some concerns. They want us to maybe go do a welfare check. And as we mentioned, we do not do those. So there has to be a current allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And it cannot be anticipatory that we think something's going to happen. Sadly, we would love to be in the prevention business, but we are in the investigation. And so we go once we have a credible allegation that something has occurred. We are not allowed to investigate on tribal lands unless we have a memorandum of understanding, and currently we do not have any. So any abuse, neglect, or exploitation that comes to us that occurred on a tribal land will be referred over to the proper tribal authority. And then we do not investigate incidents in long-term care facilities when alleged theft or loss of residents' money has been taken. If there's an unknown perpetrator, or if the facility has reimbursed the resident, we do not get involved. And then because our capacity, we had to make some decisions in our capacity to handle the cases and the amount of financial scams that are sadly out there. About 3 years ago, we made the decision and made an administrative rule change where we do not investigate financial scams or fraud. We refer those over to the agencies that have the resources to really go after these unknown perpetrators and these large perpetrators that just go after older adults and people with disabilities. So we will provide resources, but we will not open cases on scams or fraud. So APS's investigative processes, most important, we believe in self-determination. It's written in our rules and our authority. So we respect the lifestyle that is knowingly and voluntarily chosen by the vulnerable adult. And sometimes that can be tough because vulnerable adults may choose to live in a situation that is not the safest or the healthiest, but they do have that right. A vulnerable adult with a capacity to consent has the right to live the way they want. All of our services are voluntarily unless they're court ordered. And one thing that's important, and I'll wrap up a little bit with this as well, is it's important to understand that the vulnerable adult has many stages of an incident, not only through the incident itself, but then through investigation and prosecution. And most important, we want to make sure we're promoting victim recovery. In Utah, in our fiscal year, so our fiscal year runs from July to June. So for 2020, we investigated 4,438 cases of maltreatment in vulnerable adults. And just some statistics that are interesting for you. 59% of our victims were female, 40% are male. 66% of the allegations occurred in their own home. And 59% of alleged perpetrators were a family member or relative. And that's really sad that the people in our state are being victimized by their loved ones. So of those cases, as I mentioned, that many people suffer more than one form of abuse, we investigated, or our fantastic investigative team investigated 5,844 allegations. Our top 3 allegations in 2020 were financial exploitation, and caretaker neglect, and then emotional abuse. And that was the same also in 2019. I think for 8 years running, financial exploitation has been our #1 allegation investigated. It is tough in the state of Utah, and it is rampant, and we really need to get a grip on making sure people are protected and try to get some prevention work going on out there. And then caretaker neglect is also the 2nd highest, I think 3 years running. So we are working on some initiatives within our agency to try to address these. So let's just go over abuse and neglect, what it is. Briefly, this is going to be a brief presentation because this session is not about abuse and neglect, it's about multidisciplinary approaches. But we do want to review it because we think it's important as we head into the key factors of multidisciplinary approaches. So the physical signs of abuse and neglect are injuries that are inconsistent, cuts, puncture wounds, dehydration or malnutrition, forced isolation, poor coloration, inappropriate administration of medication, soiled clothing or bed, frequent use of hospital or health care, lack of necessities such as food, water, utilities, shelter, and then lack of personal effects or living environment. I think it's important, along with some of the more obvious signs, you have to look at the more behavioral signs, the emotional signs behind abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And people that have gone through traumatic experiences, they suffer fear, anxiety, agitation. They're often very isolated, withdrawn. Depression can set in. They might be non-responsive and resigned to their situation, or just have ambivalence towards it because they've accepted it as a way of life. Or they're very reliant on their caregiver. They're very reliant on their family, and they don't want to get them in trouble, and they don't want to be isolated from their family. So they have a fear of reporting against their family. Oftentimes they'll make contradictory statements. They might have hesitation to talk openly, and they might be confused or disoriented. Now, before we go to the next slide, so hold off, Rebecca, I am going to warn you, I want to talk a little bit about the trauma of abuse and neglect, but I do want to warn you that the next slide is a tough one to see. So if you are someone who, this could be a difficult situation to see physical pictures of abuse and neglect, you can continue listening, but I would turn your heads or hide your screen. Okay, go ahead, Rebecca. So one of the things, and the reason that we show this picture is, one of the things we have to realize is the trauma that abuse and neglect faces. And sometimes we often don't see the physical signs and the emotional signs. But we look at the situation and we look at these 3 pictures, and I'm not going to go into the stories of these 3 individuals, but we look at the pictures and we see the horror of bruising and open sores and malnutrition. But this didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen in a day. And so when we look at trauma that we go through and the importance of trauma-informed care and the importance of how did a victim get to this point, we have to look at the timeline that led up to it, the abuse that they suffered for quite some time to get to this point. And then we have to make sure that we deliver a trauma-informed approach to everything that we do with this victim so that they can heal not only from the physical wounds, but from the emotional wounds that brought them to this point. When we talk about self-neglect, I know that we get a lot of calls and people want us to open cases for hoarding. And we have to really, we don't open cases for hoarding in and of themselves. We really have to look at, when does self-neglect become an immediate safety help or hazard to the victim? So some of the warning signs of self-neglect are when there's inadequate heating and plumbing. There's animal feces all over the home. The residence is extremely dirty, filled with garbage. They're not cashing their monthly checks. They're not getting the proper medical care. They lack fresh food. They won't allow anyone into their residence, often because they're ashamed. They understand the situation that they're living in, and they don't want the judgment from the outside world. Or they're dressing inappropriately for existing weather. A combination of all of these could lead to self-neglect. But again, if that person has capacity to make those decisions, it can be really tough to watch someone live in a difficult situation and to let it continue. So we have to make some tough calls in these cases of when we have to intervene and when we have to say that the person has a right to live the way they choose. Let's talk a little bit about financial exploitation. So as I mentioned, financial exploitation is the largest allegation and has been for several years running in our state. We have a grant right now that is specifically addressed on trying to improve outcomes for financial exploitation. But some of the warning signs of financial exploitation are unusual charges on their accounts, HTM transactions for someone who is homebound. They're financially dependent on the victim. We have seen this during COVID in particular. Many people lost their jobs and they have moved in with their older parents and or grandparents, and they become dependent on their victim's resources. Bills are unpaid, utilities are shut off, the victim suddenly has insufficient funds to cover things that they've been able to cover for years. They don't understand their finances or understand their assets. They'll say someone else is handling them, oh, it's okay, and it's usually a family member. When their properties or valuables are disappearing. There's also could be a recent change in will, property ownership, or power of attorney. Romance scams are huge right now. They have a new best friend or a love interest that wants to help them with their finances. We already kind of mentioned the child or grandchild moving in. And then risk factors for financial include grief, social isolation, living with a large number of unrelated people. And other risk factors could be someone that has cognitive impairments, someone that has early onset dementia or late onset dementia, and any medical situations that impair their ability to manage their finances or understand, so that they have to turn them over to somebody. As we work with vulnerable populations, it's really important not to make assumptions, that we go in with an open mind, and that we assume, especially when we don't know the person, that that they have the ability to make their decisions. We need to treat people as adults, use person-centered language. We want to make sure that we speak directly with the person, and that can be tough sometimes. That can be really tough for our investigators when they have family in the room, or they have the perpetrator in the household, or even when they have a paid caregiver with them. Everybody wants to talk over them, but we have to make sure that we respect the victim and the victim's words and the victim's choices. We want to make sure we talk to the victim as if they're an adult, that we do not talk down to them, that we do not speak for them ourselves, nor do we allow others to speak for them. We want to ensure that we empathize with their situation, that we allow time for response. Many people that have some sort of cognitive decline need some time to process the situation, and they may not respond immediately. We need to make sure we offer accommodations when we're working with vulnerable populations. They might need to meet in the morning. That might be a better time for them. They might be hard of hearing. They might need a translator. And we need to be sensitive to that and to their perspective to the incidents that have occurred in their life. And then we also need to be aware of our own reactions. We need to make sure that we're empathetic and that we're listening, and that we're giving good body language back to our victims when we're talking to vulnerable adults. As I mentioned earlier, it's critical that we provide trauma-informed care in all of our work that we do, and this will be important along with our multidisciplinary approach. We have to realize the impact of the trauma on the victim. Like I said, it didn't happen typically overnight. Oftentimes it's happened for years or months, and there are events that have led up to that, and we have to understand that time frame. We need to recognize the signs and symptoms of the trauma that they're facing and ensure that they feel that they're in a safe environment, that they have trust with the people that they're dealing with that are helping them through this process, whether that be a support staff, whether that be our investigators, or whether that be law enforcement or prosecution. We need to make sure they have the support systems in place to help them through the situation. And most important, we need to make sure that they feel that they are empowered and that they have a voice and a choice in the decisions that go on with their lives. If we do a victim-centered approach, and if we all practice it as we lead into the multidisciplinary approach, we will focus on the needs and concerns of the victims, and we will minimize re-traumatizing the victims with the services that we're trying to provide or the interventions we are trying to do. So it's important that we provide support for the victims advocates and service providers, that we empower them to be engaged, and then we give them an opportunity to play a role. One of the things that's really tough that we sometimes forget about is they might have suffered abuse and neglect or exploitation for years, then we become involved, then we refer it to law enforcement, then we refer to prosecution, and they have to continually relive this event. And we will have much better outcomes if we do a victim-centered or a trauma-informed approach, if we help the victim from incident all the way through healing and victim recovery. So, I got ahead of myself and I spoke over that. So that is going to be the end of my portion before I turn it over to Rebecca, and the remainder of the presentation will be on multidisciplinary approaches and how we can all work together to help the older adults and people with disabilities through allegations of maltreatment. But I want to pause right here before I turn it over to Rebecca and see if there's any questions, Janet or Cheryl.
I don't show any.
Great, that's because I have the depressing part. Rebecca gets the more fun part. All right, okay, you're up, Rebecca.
Okay, so now that we understand really the large scope of this problem, I want to talk about some solutions. And one thing that we are really trying to work towards is having a multidisciplinary approach. And we're using this through multiple avenues, but primarily through multidisciplinary teams. And these are not only beneficial to the victims that we serve, but it's also very beneficial to our team members and also to our community. So just so that we're all on the same page, the definition of a multidisciplinary team is a group of people, essentially 3 or more disciplines that are coming together, and they're bound by a common purpose. So they have a shared definition of the problem that they are addressing. So sometimes teams are focused maybe primarily on victim services, or they may be more focused on prosecution. There are some teams that are focused specifically on self-neglect. So having that shared definition of what the problem is. And then they're also characterized by these 5 elements. So we have shared decision-making, partnership, interdependency, balanced power, and process. So these are really important so that no one agency is primarily responsible for the decisions that are made for these alleged victims, and that we all have shared power and partnership in coming up with solutions. Here's a quote from the MDT Manual that was created by the Elder Justice Initiative. And it says, currently, multiple agencies are may simultaneously be working on the same elder abuse case, with each agency working within its own silo, unaware of the interventions, strategies, and case planning being attempted by other agencies. This approach is neither victim-centered nor responsive to the myriad of victims' needs. And this is something that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, that when we're all working in our own individual silos, we may not understand what other agencies are doing, and this can be incredibly frustrating for the victims that we're serving, and also for us as service providers. So we're going to talk a little bit more about why this multidisciplinary approach is so important, and how it's not only effective and efficient, but it's also very victim-centered and really helps these victims to have better outcomes. So some of the benefits to these victims through these teams is that it really enhances the probability that no matter where they enter a system of care, they will have access to coordinated services. So if they are reaching out to their medical provider because of the abuse that they're experiencing, they're guaranteed to still have this coordination. Or if they're reaching out to APS or law enforcement, they can know that we're still working together on their case. It also reduces the number of services that they have to navigate. As service providers, we know that it's incredibly hard to understand all of the different services. And I really empathize with those people that are trying to understand that without a knowledge of these systems. And so by working together, we can really reduce them having to understand the medical system and the legal system and a mental health system. We can really do that work for them. It also promotes greater awareness of what services are available and improves their access and the receipt of these services, because they're going to know more about what's available and have the support to access those. It also creates an integrated array of services that are tailored specifically to that person's needs. So as service providers, we can come together and collaborate, better understand what the scope of the problem is, the background behind the situation, and really find services that are specific to that person's own needs. One of the great things is that these teams create solutions that are creative and innovative and things that nobody can really think of on their own, which is really helpful to just have a team of people that you can talk to, you can brainstorm with, and come up with solutions together that maybe you couldn't have come up on your own. It also provides an informal support for these victims. They've got a number of service providers that are assisting them, that are following up with them and helping them beyond this crisis period, especially with us. At APS, sometimes we're limited in what we can do outside of our investigations. So this really allows us to partner with other agencies that they can provide those services outside of just the abuse, and that really can reduce the recurrence of abuse and therefore affect their long-term health. And it also allows us to focus on our own job responsibilities. This makes it so that our law enforcement officers don't also have to be social workers or advocates. It makes it so our investigators don't have to be medical providers. And so that allows each person to do their job more efficiently and also, better, so that we can better serve these victims' needs. There are a lot of benefits to our team members as well. We have greater confidence in our case planning because we have a whole team of 30 plus consultants that we can talk to about what we're doing and make sure that people are looking at some of the gaps that we might not be seeing. And our decisions are better informed. And again, they're reviewed before we implement them so that we know that this is the best approach to take. We can also back each other up, especially when maybe somebody doesn't want to report to law enforcement or they don't want to seek medical treatment. It allows us to show the victim, hey, this service is actually really important. I know the person who will be providing the care for you. There's somebody I work with and there's somebody that you can trust. And we can really understand what services will be provided and therefore better understand how to advocate for them. We also learn each other's mandates and jargon. And this is incredibly helpful because so many times we'll make decisions or another agency will make a decision and we say, we're not really sure why this happened. And so being able to come together and talk through that process is really helpful so that we can say, hey, this is what I'm limited by. This is what I wasn't able to do because of the mandate that I have. Or another agency can say the same. And therefore it really builds trust and helps us to understand the process that we all have to go through. And this can also broaden our understanding of what elder abuse is and how to sharpen our professional skills. We really learn from each other and what services are also available. And we can also obtain assistance in a lot of these difficult cases. A lot of times when these cases are presented to our teams, other solutions have been attempted. And so we have people come together that just say, hey, I'm really stuck. I'm not really sure what to do. And we can come together and talk about those. It also promotes collegiality and just motivation. It's a safe place for us to talk about some of the difficult things that we've been dealing with, relieve some of the tension, and also share some of those feelings of hopelessness or frustration, because we all know that burnout kind of comes and goes among all of us. We can identify the service gaps and make systemic changes. Really, when we get together, we can see some of these more systemic issues or more macro-related issues that maybe not one agency would have identified on their own, but when we start to see it affecting other agencies, then it's easier to come together and come up with solutions. And it also improves our ability to share information and resources. It's amazing how often it's hard to get in touch with people, but when you have a meeting with them once a month where you can talk about the issue, it's a lot easier to get in touch and to have that open communication. So some of the barriers that we experience as service providers and also our alleged victims may experience from having an uncoordinated system. It's just too many systems for victims and families to navigate. And so it's really hard for them to know where to get services, how to navigate all these things. They may not even know what's available and how to access it. And that really ultimately turns to less than optimal outcomes for these victims. And there's a lack of coordination between service providers. Sometimes we're not coordinating together. The victims can be jostled from one place to another. They may not understand that they're switching service providers, or they may not understand the differences between the service providers, and that can be really frustrating for them. And this is especially hard for individuals who may be having diminished capacity or maybe some kind of mental impairment. this is even more difficult for them to process. Sometimes the services can be duplicated, and this is especially true of interviews or assessments. We know that a trauma-informed approach, we want to limit the number of times that a victim has to share their story, because this can be really re-traumatizing when they have to share it over and over again. And without this uncoordinated system, we're really taking this approach of whatever we have will fit everybody. And so having this coordination really allows us to look specifically at the strengths, the needs, the problems, to come together and better understand the background of the story, or maybe some other factors that we may not have known about. Sometimes victims receive conflicting recommendations, which is incredibly hard when these are professionals that are giving these recommendations. It's hard for them to choose which one to follow. And also, the fragmented services fail to acknowledge the underlying problems, or even sometimes these more macro-related issues that affect our victims. Just for some context, some of the core members that we include on our teams, obviously Adult Protective Services. We work really closely with law enforcement and prosecution, especially on teams that are more focused on that prosecution piece. We try to include victim advocates as much as possible. We work very closely with aging services, incredible resources in the aging community that are so essential for the people that we are serving. And then also mental health and healthcare providers, to make sure that we're seeing this from a holistic approach. Some additional members that we include, sometimes we include code enforcement. This is particularly relevant for just community well-being, and also sometimes for our self-neglect and hoarding cases. Fire and EMS, they are often the first responders to cases for individuals that may not call APS or maybe after our calls, so they're really important for us to include. Housing authority, city representatives, the VA. We work very closely with disability service providers, especially DSPD, and also the Office of Public Guardian. And sometimes we involve other resources depending on the victim's needs. Just for a little bit more context of how these meetings are actually run, so you know what it is that we're talking about. So we actually have created a number of teams over the last year. And currently all of these teams are meeting virtually because of the pandemic, but it has also made it accessible to people who may be in rural communities who would have to travel. So right now we're doing those all virtually, and we're hoping to still kind of do virtual and in-person meetings so that we can reach those people who may not be able to attend in person. Most of our teams meet monthly for about an hour. We do introductions so that we all know who is on the team. We always review our confidentiality agreements, which is a really important component. And then we provide training. So it's not just about case staffing, but also about us providing training to whoever else is on the team. We'll follow up on previous cases to see what was successful, whatever interventions may be needed in the future, and see if there are any kind of holes in what was done that we still need to fill. And also we'll collaborate on the new cases. So anybody who is on the team can bring a case forward. This doesn't necessarily have to be a case that has an open APS investigation or a case where we know abuse is happening. It could just be somebody who just wants to talk through a situation. And then of course we have an opportunity to share resources, talk about upcoming events, and see if there are other ways we can support each other. So that training piece, as I mentioned, is such an important part. And there are really three types of training that we provide in these MDTs. One is cross-training. And this has been really fun for me to be able to see our team members teaching each other and to train each other on the mandates that we have, the jargon that we use, where we can contribute, what we have, what we don't have. And we have a lot of experts on our teams who can come and provide this expertise to our other team members. We also provide professional training. So we'll try to find speakers or presenters that can come in that have expertise in other areas, and we work with our teams to identify what the gaps are of some services or some training that we may need to know more about, and then we'll reach out to trainers. This really increases our familiarity with various populations, various strategies, and really make sure that we're all on the same page, so we have the same exposure to the same information and resources. And then we'll provide training also just on how to be on an MDT. Sometimes just coming together isn't necessarily enough to know how to function effectively as a team. So we talk about collaboration, we talk about our goals, some best practices on how we can serve our community. And also we talk about engagement and how to recruit new members and how to get more people involved, see who's missing. As I mentioned, that confidentiality piece is so important. So I just want to touch on this a little bit, that information sharing is essential to our MDTs. It's a serious issue that we really have to consider how to approach. So each MDT develops their own policy on how they will meet the needs of the MDT while also not violating any one agency's or profession's confidentiality policy. Sometimes confidentiality is sometimes used to keep people from sharing information. And when we really look at the policies, we see that there is a lot of opportunity to still collaborate, even with confidentiality being considered. So, we want to make sure our team members know who's on the team, what their own limitations are, what the limitations are of the team, because sometimes these case reviews, the information can be subpoenaed or may be discoverable. So we want to make sure that everyone is aware of their own mandates so that they can share effectively. And if people are in a situation where they feel less comfortable sharing information, then they can also share information about the case without revealing the victims' names or identifiable information. So they could use maybe a pseudonym, or they could come up with maybe like change a little bit in the case so that it's not identifiable. And all of this really helps them to get the resources that they need while still protecting the individual. Just coming together as a team is not necessarily enough to be successful. And so a few things that we really work on promoting within these teams is the acknowledgement of each member's participation and contribution. We know that we can't do it on our own, and we invite each person to the team for a very specific reason. And so we really try to encourage our team members to appreciate each other and to acknowledge what each person can contribute. We also need professional expertise, and not only from one or two people, but from a large variety of people to better help us fill in the gaps that may be in the services that we're providing. We also have to have trust and accountability, and this is such a huge part of our teams. We need people to feel comfortable sharing information. We also need to feel comfortable acknowledging our mistakes and having a place where we can demonstrate our weaknesses and feel safe doing so that we can grow and learn. Effective and honest communication is obviously an important part of any team. And we also really try to promote diversity and inclusivity, not only within our teams, but also in the communities that we're serving, and making sure that we are being inclusive of those who are especially vulnerable. Obviously, having mutual respect is really important. Having people participate, to share ideas, to feel comfortable and safe, sharing the resources that they have or their experiences, and to speak up, especially if something's like not sitting right for them, or if they've got an experience that might be different from the consensus of the team. That's really important. We want to be working together to enhance our capacity, to not just be doing what we've been doing all along, but to learn and to grow and improve. And having those positive relationships. Also, conflict resolution is so important, because we know every team is going to have conflict, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to have conflict that ultimately is resolved, and resolved in a positive way that brings the team closer together. So that can be a difficult process to go through, but it's really important for our teams. And then, of course, we want to improve the outcomes for the victims, so that we're, again, increasing our capacity, we're growing, and we're learning and improving what they're able to receive. I want to share a success story from one of the cases that we have worked on from our teams. We had a vulnerable adult, and the case was brought forward to the MDT. They had a cognitive impairment, and their mental health was really diminishing. They had very limited support. They were low income, and they really didn't have a funding source. They didn't have Medicaid or Medicare, and so it was really hard for them to access services, and the perpetrator was actually the caregiver. So on top of all these other things that they were dealing with, they also had a perpetrator who was taking advantage of them. So prior to the MDT, a lot of different agencies were involved in this case. We had received a number of cases. Law enforcement had received dozens of calls on this individual. We found out later that the DA's office was involved, that the person did have a mental health provider that was providing some kind of psychiatric treatment, and that a medical service provider was also involved. But each of these teams or each of these individuals was really working independently. And so prior to coming together as an MDT, we were all kind of doing our own thing, trying to come up with solutions. Well, this case was brought to the MDT, and together we were able to coordinate services for this individual and to see, wow, there are actually a lot of other people that are involved with this individual that we could work together with. So through the MDT coordination, we were able to arrange for a capacity evaluation to be done. DSPD became involved and completed that capacity evaluation and provided a lot of services for them and was able to get them under their services. We also worked with the Office of Public Guardian to have guardianship services in place. And then we could also share information with law enforcement that led to charges against this perpetrator to keep this victim safe going forward. So the success was not only a result of sharing resources, but also working together as a team and to have those relationships. A lot of the team members knew about the case before they were directly involved. And so it was really helpful because when the time came for them to be involved, they already had the context and they were just ready to go. They had the relationships, they knew who to talk to, and they could really work together to come up with those solutions. So just an example of why these MDTs have been really beneficial. I'm going to share some resources and I'll go through these pretty quickly. But if you want to just take out your phone, you can use your camera and take some pictures of these so that you have these in the future. One is that the Elder Justice Initiative has created an incredible MDT guide. So you can find it on this website. They also not only have this guide, but they have a toolkit that goes with it. So if you're interested in learning more about MDTs, this is a great source. They've got activities you can engage in. They also have really good sample documents. So we've used these to create our own confidentiality policies. But you can go on there, download these documents as samples, and then create your own from them. We also have the Elder Justice Network locator map. So this is where all of the teams across the country are on a map. All of our teams here in Utah are located on this map. So if you're interested in joining a team, you can go on there, see where it's at, see what area it covers, and also the contact information so you can reach out and see if it would be appropriate for you to join their team. Also, if you're part of a team that's not on this map, we would love to know, and the map would like to know as well. So feel free to reach out to them. You can give them information about what team you're on, the name of it, so other people can find it as well. Here are some resources for working with vulnerable populations. Obviously, our state agencies are working to serve this population, and then we've also got some crisis services on here that you can utilize. Some great community resources. Obviously, we work closely with the area agencies on aging to provide aging services and a variety of other services on here, family justice centers, the Alzheimer's Association. So hopefully you can utilize these services if you're not already. Also, some specific financial resources. These are great for individuals who are experiencing financial exploitation. So definitely want to jot some of these down so that you can utilize them. Here are some specialized training and resources here in the state of Utah. So this is on our DOS website. You can go on there, great documents and brochures that you can download. These are things that you can share within your spheres of influence. We've got some information on our MDTs. There's some information about financial exploitation, ombudsman, so you can download these and share them with your networks. Just as we wrap up, just really want to emphasize that it really takes all of us working together to help these vulnerable adults and to have this holistic approach. So we need all of you. We appreciate the great work that you're doing and are excited to continue to work together to combat abuse and to make sure that we're taking care of the people in our communities. So here's our information. We have our emails on here and also my phone number. So if you have any questions about teams, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions that you have or see if we can get you on a team. So yeah, just want to check in and see what questions we have.
We are at the 5-minute, and so far I do not see any questions.
Okay. Well, great. We appreciate everyone for attending. And, you know, if you have any questions at any point in time, feel free to reach out to us. You can send us an email. You can give us a phone call. We're happy to share whatever resources we have. And I'm always happy to brainstorm with people if they want to get a team started or if they're having any problems with their teams that they're on, to feel free to reach out and we will see how we can work together. Tracy, do you have any last minute thoughts?
I don't. Great job. And as Rebecca said, please reach out anytime with any questions. If you'd like additional training for your agency, please reach out. And more importantly, if you want to be part of one of the MDTs or want to know where they're located, we would love to share and talk with you further. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reaching out and joining our session, Multidisciplinary Approach to Address Elder Adults. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you very much for your time and knowledge.